Hello, everybody. My name is Noreen Henig. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Kezar Biosciences, and it really is my pleasure to be with you here today. I really want to extend my gratitude to Susan and everybody at Lupus LA. I think one is that they provide an amazing service and opportunity for people living with lupus to get together and have educational forums like today. And overall, they're just wonderful, nice people and lovely to work with. And so it's a real privilege to join them in speaking with you today. I'd like to start by just introducing a little bit about myself. I am a physician by training. I spent my first career working at a university and actually Stanford University, which is here in California. And as an academic researcher, I spent all of my time as a physician taking care of people who had complex diseases and who had very few options available to treat those diseases. And I spent a good part of my academic career looking at ways to investigate new opportunities for new therapies in patients with complex diseases. About 12 years ago, I switched and went into drug development, and I now work for companies such as Kezar Biosciences, but essentially doing the same thing, really spending my time trying to figure out how we can bring novel, new medicines to people who don't have good therapies available to them to treat their disease. And I think lupus is one of those complex diseases where many people experience it in many different ways, but nonetheless, there's not one good therapy that works for everybody. And it's really incumbent on researchers and scientists like myself and my team to help provide new therapies for patients living with lupus. And that's exactly what we are doing. So let me tell you a little bit about Kezar Biosciences. Kezar is a San Francisco Bay Area based biotech company. Kezar Stadium, for anybody who's into sports trivia, was the original home of the San Francisco 49ers, and that's how Kezar got its name. And we actually are a company that is studying a very new approach to studying autoimmune disease. And we think we have a very interesting potential therapy that will benefit people living with lupus as well as a variety of other autoimmune diseases. And we are working hard to bring this particular molecule called KZR616 into clinical trials and demonstrate that it does have a therapeutic benefit. If you have any specific interest at all in learning more about Kezar or KZR616, links will be provided via Lupus LA. Why I'm here today is just kind of to talk to you about the importance of clinical trials. And many times clinical trials means different things to different people. But often clinical trials have a relatively negative connotation, guinea pigs or people using people for purposes that they no longer, where they will not get to benefit from it. We've heard a lot about clinical trials in the context of COVID and the COVID pandemic and development of vaccines, which was actually a beautiful example of the importance of doing really solid clinical research to bring new therapies to treat a disease that didn't exist before. In this case, in a very short time period, science and clinicians and potential people who would benefit from the vaccine came together, went through clinical trials. It generated high quality data that was able to inform the decision about whether that vaccine could do its work or not. And that led to actually this week, the first dosing of a vaccine. So of course, that's the kind of success story that everybody who works in clinical trials would like to achieve with their therapy. Now, that's not always the case. Many, many therapies that are tried in clinical trials are proven not to work. And so it becomes a stepwise series of demonstrating that a potential therapy can work for people. That series of steps often starts with just learning, is the molecule safe, right? You don't ever want to give something to someone that's actually harmful or potentially worse than the disease you're trying to treat. Then you take a next step and you do a slightly bigger study and you try to prove that the potential medicine can actually have a positive effect on people who are living with the disease. And then you take the last step and you make a bigger trial, and you often compare people who are living with the disease, and some people will get your potential therapy, other people who will not. And then you compare to see if there's a noticeable difference between the two groups of people at the end of the study. And that is what informs whether or not that potential therapy actually could be a meaningful therapy for people living with that disease. So the most important part of the whole clinical trial process is the willingness of people who are living with the disease to participate in these clinical trials. Essentially, the only way you can prove that it can be beneficial is if people raise their hand to participate. And that can often be a scary or daunting task to even think about. And clinical trials often come with a set of very formal processes that the sites or the investigative centers have to adhere to. And why is that? Why, I often get the question like, why is participating in a clinical trial so hard? Why are there's all this paperwork? We get that question from the people who participate, as well as the research nurses and study coordinators. And the answer is because you, as someone who participates in a clinical trial, is a precious resource. And if we are going to conduct a clinical study, then we want to do it well, and we want to collect data that can be interpreted and answer the question that was posed at the beginning of the trial. And if the question that was posed at the beginning of the trial is, asking the question, is this potential therapy safe? You want to be able to answer that question. If you want to ask the question, does this potential therapy, improve somebody's rash or improve somebody's lupus nephritis, or does their joint pain get better? Then you actually want to make sure that when you collect the data that you can answer that question. So again, I think I've talked a little bit about the purpose and the importance of participating in clinical trials. And I hope I've kind of explained a little bit about the different phases of trials or the different steps that it takes to prove that a therapy is a meaningful therapy in patients living with the disease. One of the commonest questions that also comes up is kind of, what is the risks to someone who participates in a clinical trial? And those risks can, be fill in the blank. For some people, it's the risk of, will this potential therapy do them any harm? And one of the most important things to know is that there's extraordinarily rigorous processes that exist before a company like Kezar could even enroll its first patient in its first study of a new medicine. And those are very well characterized steps that you have to take with the regulatory authorities, and you have to prove a certain level of safety and predictability from what you know about this new potential therapy. Most new therapies go through a phase where the first people who are studied are actually healthy. They have no chance whatsoever of actually benefiting from the medicine because they didn't have anything wrong with them to begin with. But it's a really good opportunity to evaluate a whole range of people, different ages, men and women from all different backgrounds or from all over the globe, to find out if the medicine is safe. And so one of the questions that you might ask a doctor that you might join in a clinical trial about a potential new therapy is, was this medicine studied in healthy individuals before it came to this trial? Or what do you know about the safety of this before the trial that you're being presented with? It's also important to recognize that regulatory authorities such as the FDA, as well as most clinical sites, have oversight bodies that are constantly monitoring the trials. And so this is a way of ensuring and protecting your health. It also protects your identity. That's another risk that people often ask me about. How do I know that I'm going to stay anonymous in this trial? It also is something that allows you to know that if you felt that there was any harm that came to you by participating in the trial, there is an authority that you could go to that would understand the workings of the trial, ensure that the trial was being conducted as it was intended to be conducted, and help you work through whatever issues you might have. There are a number of things that are, I think, kind of hot topics right now in the world of clinical trials. And again, one of the hottest topics is diversity and the importance of diversity in clinical trials. And there was a time in the not too distant past where the individuals that were enrolled in trials were extremely alike. And mostly when I say extremely alike, they were almost always men. And the reason is because people were nervous about studying drugs in women. What if they got pregnant? What if something happened, they couldn't take care of their children? It was a relatively kind of, let's just say, uninclusive approach to clinical trials, and it led to a realization that we really only knew about how drugs worked in less than 50% of the population. So there's been an increase in the desire to include individuals of all ages, including pediatric patients early on, because many times it is pediatric patients that could benefit from it. Ethnically diverse individuals, underrepresented communities, and often that means individuals from different socioeconomic groups or also different geographic areas where living circumstances or diet may influence the outcome of the study. And so again, very important to widely study the medicine to make sure that you know who will the drug benefit and who will it not benefit. So I am going to pause right here. I was provided with a list of questions. But I think what I'm going to do now is start reading through the questions and remind you that if you have any questions that you can pop it into the question box or comments as I'm talking. And if I see them up here, I'm happy to handle them in real time with you. So the first question that I received was, how do clinical trials work? Clinical trials work in a number of different ways. So one is that somebody has a good idea to ask the clinical trial question. When you're asking a clinical trial question about a potential diagnostic test or a question about what happens with people who are living with this disease when they have this experience, those are clinical trials. When I talk about clinical trials, I tend to talk about clinical trials to evaluate a new potential medicine. And so those are called interventional trials. And interventional trials are essentially where you give the population your new potential therapy. and you compare what happens to people who do get the medicine versus those who don't. Often that is done where there is somebody called a sponsor, and that sponsor may be a researcher at an academic institution such as Stanford, or a researcher at a drug development company like Kezar Life Sciences who's asked the original question. And then we partner with people who are experts in the area and who also take care of patients. And these become what you call your research site or your study site. They go through all the paperwork, identify a team, make sure that team is well trained in the medicine as well as in many of the data collection activities that happen. And then they get approval from this outside institutional body called the IRB, which basically says that this is a real trial, that this trial can answer the question that it's meant to answer, and that it will be conducted in a way that is safe and respectful of the people participating in the study. The second question is asking a question about if medical trials are safe to participate in. And medical trials in general, the goal is to ensure the level of safety to the very, very best of everyone's ability. Now, at one point in time, there is that very first person who is going to take that first dose of medicine. And until that point in time, you can't, say that we have a long history of experience until that begins to happen. So participating in what's called a phase 1 study is the phase of studies where you have a little bit less information about the safety, but it doesn't mean that it's not safe, or at least the amount of safety that you could possibly ensure hasn't been done to date. And that goes to all of the work that it takes to actually even take that first step in a clinical trial. Safety is monitored continuously throughout clinical trials. And to be quite honest, everybody errs on being very, very conservative. As soon as there's one unusual thing, it's often an opportunity to pause and evaluate and see if what is seen as a safety concern, or if it's something usual to the underlying disease or could be expected. Question number 3 is, how can someone find out about a clinical trial? So clinical trials are available broadly on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And that's, again, a very monitored website. And any clinical trial that is there has been vetted to make sure that it will take care of its researchers and all of the participants in the research protocol. So that's usually your best source of information for ongoing clinical trials. And it has a very easy to use search engine where you can just put in the specific disease that you're looking for and find out what clinical trials are active. And then if you scroll through those sites, they will often not only share with you what the trial is about, but also where research sites are that may be near you. Question number 4, how do patients know if they're candidates for a certain trial? So the most important answer to that question is you usually don't. So one of the things that people like myself who design clinical trials do is we try to make sure that the people who are included in the trial are enough alike that you could make a decision about whether or not your new medicine made a difference in those patients or not. That's called controlling variables. And it usually comes with a very long laundry list of things that would make a candidate able to participate in the trial or not. So what I always encourage people to do is to, if you see that there's a clinical trial near you and it sounds interesting to you, you should reach out to the study team at that site and let them ask you some few questions about your eligibility. And then they may even encourage you to come to the site for what's called a screening visit to see if you would be eligible for the trial. One thing to caution about is if you are not eligible for a specific trial. It does not mean you are a failure or unstudyable. It just means that it's not a good match with that trial. And I would encourage you to not be discouraged and stay open-minded and participate in future trials or a different trial. The next question is, do you have to pay to participate in a trial? The answer is an emphatic no. Participation in a trial is purely voluntary. You sign what's called an informed consent, that you've been explained what the risks and the benefits of participation is. In general, we are not allowed to pay people to participate in clinical trials because that would be a kind of against the idea that participation is voluntary. But many clinical trials, especially ones that require a lot of visits or travel to the research site, will reimburse you for travel expenses or reimburse for anything else that causes an inconvenience related to the trial. And so you should certainly ask the research site what the reimbursement and honorariums associated with participating in the trial is. The next question on the list is how many times can you participate in a clinical trial? And the answer to that is as many times as you would like. Most clinical trials are written in a way that they do not allow you to participate in a clinical trial, 2 clinical trials or more at the same time. There are some very rare exceptions where you may have signed a consent to participate in what's called a registry trial, where your physician may just be collecting some baseline information about you and your disease. And when you participate in a registry study, sometimes you are eligible to participate in a different type of trial, such as an interventional trial. But for the most part, you should only be participating in 1 trial at a time. But that doesn't mean that over the course of many years, you couldn't participate in multiple clinical trials. The next question on the list has to do with if there's any other requirements other than receiving the treatments. And the answer is yes. With most clinical trials, there are usually requirements in terms of staying in touch with the research side, sometimes getting your blood drawn, sometimes having different measurements taken, such as questionnaires about how you are feeling, or having the research team measure things related to your symptoms. So if you're talking about someone who has lupus and has multiple manifestations of lupus, they may be interested in collecting urine samples if you have lupus nephritis, or they may be interested in measuring how well your joints are functioning or how much swelling you have if you have arthritis related to your lupus. So there is it's not just about taking the medicine, it's also about kind of upholding all of the need to collect the data. And again, that circles right back to what I said at the top is participating in a trial means that you collect data that you can interpret and answers the question that you set out to answer. Because otherwise it's not worth anybody's time at all to conduct that trial. The next question is who decides who is chosen to participate in clinical trials? So that's usually spelled out very clearly in what's called a written protocol. And if you meet all the eligibility criteria, otherwise known as inclusion-exclusion criteria, then you will be eligible for the trial. And very often, if the investigator says you are not eligible for the trial, and you ask them why not, they should be able to shed light on why you are not eligible for that particular trial. The last question on the list that I'm going to take before I open it for live questions has to do with inequity in medicine and impact on clinical trials. And I think everybody recognizes that in the United States, access to health care is not equal. It is something that many people are trying to fix. And certainly inequity access and lack of access to medicine often shifts access to clinical trials. Either you're not in touch with a doctor who is participating in clinical trials, or you're concerned that you would have out-of-pocket expenses related to the clinical trial, or you're concerned that if you participate in a trial that other people will benefit from it, but you won't have access to that benefit. And those are all very legitimate questions and concerns. I think that the good news about being part of clinical trials in 2020 is that many of these questions and concerns are being addressed head on. And the goal from not just the folks who are sponsoring the trials, but also from regulatory authorities and coalitions of individuals who work in drug development are all working very hard to address these questions. And I would just say you should have a high level of confidence and ask your questions to the investigating site. And if you feel comfortable, move ahead. And if you don't feel comfortable, then, again, voluntarily step back and look for a different clinical trial that you may be comfortable in. So with that, I am going to see if there are any questions. As I'm scrolling through, it looks like the reach on this is amazing. We've got Montreal, Canada, New York. One question here that I say is, I take immunosuppressants. Would it be wise to take the COVID vaccine? So it's really a question that I truly believe that you should address with your healthcare provider. Most clinical trials will encourage you to get standard of care. So if that includes vaccines, you should definitely get vaccines. Even if you are on immunosuppressants in general, there are vaccines that your body should respond to, and being protected against a rampant deadly virus, I think, is always in everybody's best interest. But again, probably best to have that conversation with your physician. One of the other questions on here is, what benefits will this help lupus patients, and will it help all types of lupus? Again, this is a really great question. So not all trials being conducted in patients with lupus will help all types of patients with lupus, with all manifestations. But again, there's very likely a trial that if you are eligible, then it means that you and your own manifestations of lupus are likely to benefit that. I can share that at Kezar, we are very aware of the fact that patients with lupus often have different manifestations, where some people, their joints are more problematic than their skin, or their lupus nephritis, which affects the kidneys, is more of an issue than their skin or their joints. And when you're studying a medicine that could potentially benefit all aspects of lupus, it becomes a bit of a challenge how you design the clinical trial. But the right answer is to do a well-designed clinical trial to be able to explore all the possibilities, or perhaps do a series of clinical trials so that you can be as inclusive as possible. So I believe that we are getting towards the end of the time. I really want to thank everybody so much for joining this call. This has been a treat and a new experience for me. Again, I want to thank Lupus LA for arranging this. And if there are additional questions that I can address, I'm more than happy to work with Lupus LA and you to provide you answers to your questions. Thank you very much, and happy holidays to everybody.